As usual, I am Sam Harvey from the Center for Career and Professional Development. I'm Professional Development Coordinator in the office, and this is Coffee and Conversations, the bi-weekly webinar that I do to kind of cover basics. We always have our previous iterations posted on our YouTube, which you might be watching this on, and I just threw the link to our YouTube in the chat if you want to check out any of these past ones we've done. Today we're going to talk about resumes and cover letters. So really now that in the past couple of months, I've really gone into really how do you find opportunities, how do you situate yourself and really figure out what's the right opportunity for you. So now that you've kind of found those opportunities, what are you going to need to apply to them and actually pursue them? So two of the biggest things that you're going to need document-wise are going to be your resume and your cover letter. Cover letter is going to be a little bit dependent on the company, exactly how they do, but I'll get into that a little bit further on. So we're going to start with building a resume. So what is a resume for? What does it look like? What should be included on there? All of that. And I'm going to also pull up for a little bit our resume guide that we have through our office that outlines a couple of other areas as well, has some examples, but you can find a ton of stuff out on the internet about this as well. So the first real thing is when you're starting with a resume is to figure out what to include. Depending on where you are in your career journey, this might be really easy to figure out because you're like, cool, I have a ton of experience. I really want to focus on the experience. If you don't have as much experience and especially direct experience to the position that you're applying to, there's a bunch of different other ways that you can show your expertise in this area. So what I have highlighted here, and especially in this first column, and I always forget that you can't actually see when I highlight stuff, but in the first column I have highlighted out there contact info, education, experience, and skills. These are pretty much the basics that should be on almost every resume. I'm sure that I can find examples where it might not happen, but for the most part, these will always be there. The contact info, including mostly your cell phone number or the best way for someone to call you. Put a number there that you will actually pick up. And if you are applying for jobs and have your resume in the world, pick up professionally. You'll put your email address there. So once more, a professional email address. You can use your Pratt email if you have that, or if you have a Gmail, that's your name, but sort of staying away from those kind of 90s versions of like Cool Girl 2418 or something like that. And then on top of that, if you are in a visual major, this is where you would usually put your link to your resume someplace, or not your resume, sorry, to your portfolio, which we will talk about portfolios in the next version of this, so in 2 weeks from now. And then you would also put possibly a link to your LinkedIn in there. Some place people want it, some people suggest it. It's kind of one of those you could. The big thing that you might think you would put on there, but you don't necessarily have to, is your street address. Most people are not sending snail mail these days, so what you could put instead is sort of a town. So for me, for instance, I would put more Brooklyn, New York. I wouldn't put my exact address on there. They don't need that information, so it's just broader to say, cool, I'm located in Brooklyn, New York. And if you're possibly relocating because of that, that can be a helpful indicator for them to know that, okay, cool, we like this person, but we're going to have to definitely probably do some more stuff over Skype, which is good for them to know. The next area and exactly where this lives on your resume is going to depend on how far out of school you are, but you're going to want to show your education. So going to a school like Pratt is part of why you go here, is because it comes with a name, and there is something to be said for that name being a really important factor that gets taken into account when people are looking at resumes. The further you are out from school, the less people care, the more they're going to be interested in what you've done since then, because just because you went to Pratt 20 years ago doesn't necessarily mean as much as what you've been doing for the last 5 years. But if you're a recent graduate, I would put your education at the top. And for that, you would include any secondary level of education. So you don't put your high school, you don't put your middle school, you would put it where you did your undergraduate degree, your associate's degree. If you do any certifications, if you get a master's, doctoral degree, you would put those in there. And you would go in reverse chronological order. So you put your most recent education at the top and go from there. Within the educational section, you want to outline once more what school you went to. And I'm going to talk a little bit about hierarchy on a resume once I pull up examples, but I always recommend start with the name of the school. You could do like comma, Brooklyn, New York, so where it's located, and then what you studied at that school. So that would be like, for example, I did my undergraduate here at Pratt, so I put that I have a BFA in communications design with a focus on graphic design, because that to me explains what my degree is in and what the type of work I do because of it is. So definitely looking at what the wording is on your actual degree. And then you would also, if you have any minors, so then minor in art history would be the next one. You would include the years that you attended there. If you're very far out of college and you're worried about putting those dates on there, then you don't necessarily have to put it on there. But especially if you're just graduating, it's something that people will be looking for and be confused if it's not on there, the years that you attended. To think. So that's kind of the generals for education. I'll get a little bit more into it later. Then the next section you would want is experience. So as I said, if you've been out of school for a while, experience is going to trump education, so it'll go higher. Education goes first as a recent graduate. So experience can be really anything that's one as related to the current career you're approaching as possible, and really showing what you've been doing, what skills you've cultivated in the jobs that you've done. The general thing I would say is company name, what your title was, the time you spent working there, and then really taking time to bullet point out. Bullet point is always the best sort of format for that. A resume is really a scannable document. So people are looking to see as much information about you as possible, as quickly as possible. So what did you do that they're going to care about? Once more, throughout your entire resume, always think of the what if or why test. Why should I care? Why is this person going to care that you answered the phones at the last company you worked at? Maybe they won't, and in which case maybe it doesn't belong on there. And when we get into more examples, I'll be able to concrete that a little bit more. So experience, a good thing to remember is it's not a legal document. You don't need to have every single job you've ever done. If taking out a job is going to leave a weird gap, then you might still consider putting it in there, making it maybe a smaller bullet point, but to at least cover that gap that exists. But it's not a legal document. No one is going to be like, oh, you didn't put this 6 month stint you had at this advertising agency on there. We're not going to hire you now. That's not what it's for. It's really to show what you've done and how that relates to where you're going to be going. And then the next big thing you want to highlight is your skills. For most of the visual majors out there, it's going to be a lot of like, what are your tools that you use to develop your work? What software do you use is going to be really important. What hardware do you use? So you don't necessarily want to put stuff in there like, oh, I have great organizational skills. That's not what it's really looking for. What it's looking for is more like, do you know After Effects? Do you know CAD? Do you know Rhino? Anything like that you really want to highlight that's important to your field, but also some things that maybe aren't necessarily big tools for your field, but are still good tools that you bring to the table. I, for example, took a lot of silkscreen classes when I was here at Pratt, so I would have that I could do silkscreen on my resume. And without a doubt, most employers that I talked to were always at least excited about that. Sometimes it was that they had a t-shirt idea that they'd been wanting to do and thought, oh, cool, great, this person could help us do that. It never was something that came up that I did on a job, but the fact that I had it there was always an interesting piece of my interviews. So some other things you might include might be volunteer experience that you do, and this is really if you're finding you don't have a ton of direct experience, if you haven't had a job yet, these can be great ways of just helping flesh out your resume a lot more. So volunteer experience, so anything you do there, really once more talking about what you've done there, what skills you've cultivated. It also shows sort of what causes you're interested in, which can be very nice if the place you're applying to has a similar interest in that need. You could show selected projects. This often comes up around junior, senior year. If you haven't necessarily had an internship yet, the selected projects can be a really great way of showing that you've worked in not necessarily an industry setting, but that the projects you do have encompassed a similar thing to the industry setting, so that you can show this is how I think through a full project, since most of us have full ownership throughout school of the projects that you're working on. You could put relevant coursework, so this can be really good for going beyond sort of those basic classes that you might take and covering things like advanced designing techniques you did, maybe things you did outside of your major that bring an awareness to your work. Once more covering a level of skill set to be able to show how you've cultivated the skills that are needed for the job. You might put honors and awards. This is always one of those things where you want to make sure you're focusing on awards that are, one, important to the industry that you're in, but depending on where you are in your work, if it's a school-based award, you can put that on. I would steer away from necessarily Dean's List, President's List, anything like that is that a lot of people get. But if you get any specific scholarships, you could name that you won a specific scholarship, especially if it's in relation to your work. You don't need to put how much the scholarship was for. Activities, if you're involved on campus, you could do that. You could show publications or shows that you've been in, and you could do a summary of kind of who you are. And I'm going to go show some in a little bit, so we'll look at it a little bit more then. So generally, I would say write your resume first and then work on designing it. You are going to end up changing the design a lot based off how much writing you have to put in. So I would get all the information first, then work on the design. You want the resume to be 1 page maximum, so definitely work on the design's an important aspect of it, but always write first. Proofread, proofread, proofread. You're going to look at this thing about 30 times, and you're still going to probably miss something, so hand it to someone else to proofread. Hand it to your roommate, hand it to a parent, hand it to a sibling, somebody else that can look over it to look for the typo that you missed or to make sure things make sense. Look for relevancy. As I said, does it pass that so what test? If I'm looking at it trying to figure out why you're telling me about this specific experience, then maybe that experience doesn't belong on there. And there's going to be things, especially for that you do experience-wise, that don't directly correlate with the current job you're doing. Look for those areas of overlap. If you've spent your time at Pratt working a front desk at one of the offices and now you're applying for design positions, what can you talk about that can you make that connection between customer service, between having to fill the needs of someone coming in and asking for a specific thing from you? How have you shown communication skills through that? Have you even shown that you're really good at, you can show up to your job on time and get the work done? Those are all types of things you want to put in. They don't necessarily care that you helped take out the trash at the end of the day, but they'll care that you helped keep the office clean and organized, because that shows that you're a team player in that way. I also recommend having a master resume. As I said, every experience is not going to necessarily go onto your resume, but I would always have a long multi-page resume where you have all of those experiences written out. Because it might happen that a couple years down the line, suddenly that dog walking gig becomes a little bit more relevant because you're going to be applying to a company that works with animals in some way, shape, or form. That's always just a really good thing to do, because it might not ever be something that becomes relevant again, or it might become the most relevant thing that you have that shows, okay, cool, yeah, I can do design work, but look, also I have experience with animals. That you just never know when those things will show up. So it might not work for anything else, but for that one job, it might be a good way to help you stand out from other candidates. Okay, so before I go into the cover letters, I'm gonna take a minute to go into our resume guide a little bit more. Okay, so this is our resume guide. You can find this online on our website, on the CCPD website. And I just put the link to that in our chat. It's ccpd.pratt.edu. So in here, we kind of cover a lot of great things about what a resume is, a lot of the stuff I've already talked about. We have some really great action verbs here that are going to be helpful when writing out your experiences, things to include, some cover letter stuff. And then here in the back, we have some examples of resumes. So these are all from various ones that we've worked with students. This is a really good, this one and that one, like a back and forth of two before versus after. I just want to highlight some things on these that I've already talked about. So one is this idea of a professional profile. This can also be what I called a summary earlier. Sometimes you'll also hear objective as another thing that would be included. This is, ooh, sorry about that sound. Mail people are coming by. So the professional profile is really a place where you can talk about where you've been and how that relates to where you're going. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, especially if you're looking for your first internships. As an undergraduate student specifically, there's not necessarily a ton you could put. So in this case, this person's highly motivated, enthusiastic interior design student at Pratt, a detail-oriented team player with strong customer service, vendor-supplier relationship skills, interested in brand identity. So the important part of this one is this sentence, and yeah, I can't highlight it, but it's the sentence where it says, with a strong customer service and a vendor-supplier relationship skills. That's what tells me the most about this person in this professional profile, because it tells me what I can look for maybe in these later things that come up. So you really want to consider your summary and professional profile not just a summary of what's to come, because if I look right down here, I can see that your education was at Pratt in interior design. That's not something I needed you to preamble me for. But what the summary can do is be really good at showing, like in my case, I am a career services professional that has a background in design, in graphic design, working with small companies in developing branding opportunities. That's something that you would put in your professional profile, because that gets them to go, oh, cool, great, how has this person done that now? And it gets them their interest piqued to look at the rest of this. If you're going to have a summary or a professional profile, keep it about as long as this, 2-3 sentences. An objective, is something where you would add in what you're actively looking for. So in this case, this person is interested in brand identity, retail store, and hospitality design. So the jobs they're applying to better fit into that. If not, you need to make sure you're adjusting that for every job you apply to. As I see, education, GPA, if it's over a 3.5, put it in. If it's below that, I really wouldn't. Skills and strengths, always being as specific as possible. So even with social media, I would still put what specific social medias you have experience in. Selected projects, experience. So you can see here where this person is kind of using these action verbs at the beginning of their experience to be able to really show what they did. So in this case, okay, this is someone that's organizing and managing an office space. Great. That could have more to it. Researched building products. Cool. A lot of these probably in this, especially in this book, could probably use a little bit more detail for it. But this is kind of how you want to start thinking about it, is not necessarily just putting in that you worked on motion capture, maybe not, but worked on motion capture of human facial expressions. That shows an extra level of what it was that they were doing. Really thinking, one, what were you doing? One, what was the skill that was used? So even for this worked on motion capture, I wouldn't necessarily start with maybe was it that you were outlining the motion capture? Were you capturing the facial expressions? Were you editing them later? Really going into the areas that go it. Probably one of my biggest resume pet peeves is seeing the word designed there. Sometimes the word designed is good. Sometimes that's fine. But what does designed actually mean? There's a lot of steps that go into designing something. So if you can take time and maybe it's adding more bullet points to really flesh out what designing meant, that's going to be a lot stronger than just the word design, because designing might mean, okay, you did the sketches, you did the mock-ups, you did that. Talk about doing that, because those are all things you're going to need to do in these projects at this other job that you're applying to. Okay, so I'd say generally reverse chronological order. I think I talked about that. There's a lot of different ways that these things can all kind of come together, and a lot of different layouts that you can use. The main thing, one page until you're maybe about 5 to 10 years out of graduation, and that'll depend on the jobs you've had. And then really making sure I know where to look on the resume is important. One, what section am I in? And two, what's standing out the most? These are pretty pared down ones, but one thing you'll see, and I mentioned this earlier, is often you're going to want to highlight the name of the place. So like Pratt Institute, Graham Hansen Design, rather than the job title you had, especially because job titles are important, but also where you worked is really important, especially if you get a big name on your resume, then that's going to be something that will help reel people in if they see it right away. Outside of doing your experience in reverse chronological order, which is the usual way of doing it, the other way you could consider doing it would be in order of sort of relevance. So most relevant to least relevant, especially if you maybe did an internship over the summer, but then during the school year, you're working a desk job. You might not want to have the desk job be the first thing. Then you would do it in order of relevance. And our office is always happy to help look over resumes. You usually need an appointment to get that looked at, but that's part of what we're here to help with and to make sure you're strategizing really well. So I actually pulled up, and that's not what I wanted, earlier, a job description. So a job description is really helpful, especially for writing cover letters. So I pulled up on Pratt Pro, there's a spring 2019 internship for Sony Music Entertainment. So I pulled this up just because it's really helpful to have an opportunity when writing a cover letter, even when writing a resume. It's really good to know. So in this case, they just kind of say internship. So it can be for really everything. In this case, this is a really good job description, which is why I picked this one. You'll get bad job descriptions, but you can start to see, so they're looking for interns in these areas, so that's good to know. One, do you fit into this area? Start with that. Qualifications, so unpaid, for credit only, currently enrolled. Cool. So they're not really going into the exacts of what each of these individual internships might be like. That might be available on their website. I'm going to go back in and find a more specific job posting. Okay, we're going to try this one. So this is at Adidas on their Brooklyn Creator Farm. So they're looking for creators for their internship program. So this is what they do, functions. So footwear design, apparel design, paid qualifications, enrolled in they want a portfolio. Okay, I found another broad one. And this will happen often with your job searches. You're going to look for things and you're going to find stuff that isn't being as specific as you wanted it to be. Cool. Museum of Ice Cream. Here's one. So what you want to look really at when you're writing the resume, it's helpful to look at this early, but also for the cover letter. One, what are the responsibilities of the positions? What are they looking for in somebody? So someone based in New York City, whatever, that's where you get to put your Brooklyn, New York, you're there. They want bachelor's degree, 2 years, executive assistant communications, PR work. That will all get covered on your resume. So they're looking for something that's, okay, time management skills. As I said, you're not going to necessarily list time management under that skills section on your resume. But what you can do is when you're going through this experience section on your resume, if you had deadlines that you needed to meet, if you had quick turnarounds that you needed to meet, make sure you're talking about that in your bullet points, because that's how you get to cover time management skills. Positive, energetic, collaborative team player. Do you have examples of working on a team, making sure you're talking about that you worked on a team in order to complete a project, once more in that experience section. The skills section will come a lot more from sometimes these responsibilities. They'll have lists of types of software they're looking for you to work on. It's once more going to depend really on your major, what the exact position they're looking for is. So how this all helps out when you're looking at the cover letter then is going to be that this is where you figure out your cover letter content. So the first part about writing a cover letter is to do your research. You want to have an understanding of this company and this position. Sometimes the position might be harder to research than you hope it will be, but really understanding what are they looking for in this position and who is this company, because that's what your cover letter needs to speak to. It can't just be like, hey, I'm really awesome. It has to say, hey, I think you're really awesome and I think I'd be a really awesome fit for that, in more specific terms than that. So the components of the cover letter are really that you need to answer the question of why are you interested in this company or this job. It might not be the company that interested you. It might be actively something about this job that you thought was really interesting. That's totally cool. You need to make sure you let them know that, though. What value are you going to bring to the company? What skill set do you have? And that's not just listing back what it is that they've already asked you for. You don't want to have a laundry list in the center that says, I have great time management skills. I'm awesome at working on a team. But the rule that we always have is show me, don't tell me. If you're really great at time management skills, tell me about a time that your time management skills saved the day. And you don't need to put an example for everything they've asked for in that job description. That's part of what the resume will hopefully cover and part of what your interview is to help uncover. The cover letter is a great time to expand on your resume and hit points that they don't maybe already know about you. So yeah, you talked about your internship, but that you did over the summer and kind of the mechanics of that. But did they know that your boss actually quit within the first month that you were working there and you actually ended up taking on some full-time bigger projects than you were expecting to take on? They don't know that. That's a great chance to possibly tell them that during your cover letter. It's a chance to humanize the resume a little bit more and to give a sense of who you are personality-wise. Also, really make sure you're focusing on unique skills and perspectives you bring to the table. Everyone that's applying to the job has a similar background. Yes, there'll be people that are not qualified at all, but if you really think of all of your classmates, all the people you've worked with, assume they're all applying to the job as well. If you just say, yeah, I'm really good at Photoshop, so is everybody else that's applying to the job. What is the unique perspective you bring to your abilities in Photoshop that makes you the best candidate for this job? So logistically, you want it to be less than one page. Depending on the company, the shorter is the better. If part of that research aspect is to understand the tone of the company. Is it a really tongue-in-cheek company? Is it a button-up company? If it's a button-up company, you're probably going to want to stick to a pretty standard three paragraphs, once more less than a page, 3/4 of a page, half a page. But to make sure you're really kind of doing a traditional sort of cover letter versus if it's a company that's a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, maybe you give them a sentence. And that might be it because that might be what they're looking for. So one, it's about showing that you understand the tone of this company. Usually it's about 3 paragraphs. So the 3 paragraphs are going to cover, and this is, once more, this is a loose idea of it. These are always subject to change based off the company you're applying to. So we have this also, this current thing currently covers this. So the first paragraph is usually, who are you? What are you writing them? What are you applying for? If you know someone in the company, if you talk to a faculty member that suggested they reject that this was a company you work for, this is your chance to drop any names and to lead with other cards. So after 3 years working, or I've just completed my internship here, something that just introduces who you are. And then this doesn't necessarily say it up here, but then you really want to go into like, hi, I'm Sam. I've just completed my degree at Pratt Institute. I'm really excited to apply for your graphic design position. I'm excited because. The first stuff, that's all fluff. That is a terrible way of wording it. But the most important thing is up front, really talking about why you want this position, because that's going to grab the person reading it. If you think about the Sony internship, they're going to be reading a couple hundred cover letters and resumes. They're not going to read the whole thing. You need to get their attention within the first couple of sentences, and a really great way of doing that is to show them that you understand their company, that you're specifically interested in their company, and that you understand what they're trying to do. So in some cases, that's going to be something semi-obvious. For some places, you want to try and dig a little bit deeper beyond what their general mission statement is. Like, oh, I want to work at Sony Entertainment because I love the things that you produce. That's not enough. Is it that they're on the cutting edge of something? Are they developing new technologies? What is it really about this company that interests you? And tell them that. Then in the next paragraph, you're really going to talk more about you. So what skills, expertise, experience do you bring to the table? And this is where you would bring your story about that time crunch you had at an internship up. This is where you would really talk about something that is going to help them see who you are a little bit more. As I said, this doesn't need to be super long. You don't want to laundry list back at them what they're looking at, but find something that's relevant to them. I say my main example that I go to is if you're applying to Crayola, Crayola probably gets a ton of resumes that all talk about how you played with crayons as a child. That might not then be the best story to tell them because they're going to go, cool, great, another person that does this. The same way with your designs, your first ideas might not be the best one because everyone else in the class has the same one. Might not be the best idea to go to. What else can you figure out about Crayola? What are they doing? How else are they connecting? What are they up to right now? On the flip side, if you're applying to somewhere like Vice, where they're really focusing on global news and you have an interest in global news, talk about that. That's what they're about, and yes, they're delivering news, and you might be helping in the delivery of that news, but that's their overall mission. Their greater thing is about that globalization, understanding that we live in a world where it's not country by country anymore. Talk about your connection with that and how that shows up in your work that you currently do. So it's about sort of balancing that out. One, getting away from necessarily the story that they're always getting, but also making sure that it's relevant to the company. And there's going to be some companies where you're like, cool, where it's going to be a similar thing. If you do Atlantic Records and Sony Music, your second paragraph might be very similar because your reasons for being interested in that position and are going to be very similar. Your first paragraph for those two should be at least a little bit different. Don't write something like, oh, I'm really excited to work at such an exciting and innovative company. That could be any company you're talking about. So what is it that differentiates Sony Music from Atlantic Records? Why would you specifically want to work at that place versus the other place? And then your third paragraph is a wrap-up. That might be another time to connect to something else about their mission, something else, reconnect your story back. But it's basically your wrap-up to say thank you for your time. I look forward to speaking to you about this further. But really, once more, the cover letter, the main thing I really want you to think of it as is your time to fill in gaps and let your personality show through a little bit more. And they're going to be weird to write at first. It's going to take a few. You might send someone off and then the next day think of the perfect sentence. Okay, cool. Now you've thought about it. This is one where the more you write it, the more you'll get into doing it. So the other big thing as far as logistics for the cover letter is use the same header as your resume. That's just a branding thing. That allows them to connect the things together. Remember who you are. If you use different headers, it starts to get just confusing. Okay, so that's everything that I have for the day with resumes, cover letters. You can download that guide at ccpd.pratt.edu. It's under resources and career guides right now.